The evil guinea pig is back, baby. Roquentin has returned. 4 years ago, he almost conquered the Nationsim community, but after losing the biggest war in the game's history, he disappeared. Despite being gone, every new player knows his name, and every day he's mentioned by his former enemies and allies. Contrary to popular belief, I didn't really know Roquentin before this week. I'd never had a conversation with him, but he had defined my experience with the game. Whenever I declared a war, signed a treaty, changed the tax rate, or argued on behalf of my alliance, I was likened to Roquentin. There was so much propaganda focused against him that he became more myth than man. He became a permanent rhetorical device, which may yet outlive him and all his enemies. So last week, someone else was talking about him, and I replied with my opinion. Naturally, my opinions are never correct, and the man himself messaged me to tell me I was wrong, before deleting his post. I was certain it was a troll account, because he had not been seen in 5 years, but after checking the MPO forums, I realized that it was the real deal. Talking to Roquentin is probably the worst political decision that anyone in Politics&War could make. It's inviting the wrath of the top alliances which defeated him, and now run the game. Naturally, I replied immediately, and I've spent the past 2 weeks interviewing Nationsim's Satan. Bring on the fire and brimstone, turn my alliance into a pillar of salt, because I want to know his side of the story. If I don't record it, then no one ever will, and thousands of players would have put in tens of thousands of hours without knowing what it was all for. This video is split up into chapters based on the following topics: his character, alliance history, alliance diplomacy, the Great War, the Nationsim Community, game administration, and general advice. I have reorganized the original interview and made some small edits so it's easier to consume for a new player. Naturally, some context will be lost, and some questions will go over people's heads, and for that, you have my apologies. You're a legend in the Politics&War community now, viewed both positively and negatively, and I think it's in part because of old propaganda from both coalitions, but it's also because you left without saying anything. You became more myth than man.
First off, I'm going to say, yes, my voice is grating, but bear with me. Most assessments seemed negative because most serious mentions are like never again, paranoid, terrible, and so on. It seems like I'm the ultimate target of hate. I couldn't really say anything since I got banned and people were free to do a lot of smack talk. I just did get tired of the situation and stopped logging into Discord. I was pissed off since years of my work went down the drain. It was something Alex could have dealt with sooner if he had a problem with it to begin with. It was really dismaying. That's why I really resent the cheating allegations, since I wouldn't have risked it. It was a server of 500 people. There was no expectation of stuff not leaking. It leaked from day one because there were PNW people on the Manhua server. It leaked from GPWC itself. It was posted on the Politics&War server. There was no way he did not know. Everyone knew the nature of GPWC. We view his intervention as purely political because he thought it would kill the game. Some people even said that too. That is a correct assessment.
When did you join Umbrella in Cybernations, and how did you climb the ranks there and in PNW? I can't really envision you as low-gov.
I joined Umbrella in either July or August of 2008. I started out as a basic ambassador, meaning the main thing was post stuff on the forums of other alliances. I used to do like an animal of the day thing on one. Eventually I was promoted to a Minister of Foreign Affairs position. I then ran for election to the Triumvirate and lost by 3 votes, but later on a different Triumvirate retired and I got the spot. With PNW, I was just a basic member in Vanguard, but towards the end I got more involved, like I had to get us added to a peace deal. Then as part of the merger, Frawley gave some of us gov spots since he knew we were experienced, and I got Imperial Officer of Foreign Affairs. Then I became Regent before becoming Emperor.
Is it a misconception that you were the dictator of MPO then? Was it more of an oligarchy or something like TKR with their extensive shadow gov?
No, I had final say, but people were willing to give input.
Do you ever think about playing Politics&War again?
No, for multiple reasons. I was in it for NPO, I'm kill on sight, and everyone hates me, including the admin. I just can't commit to it at this point.
If you could leave one legacy in the game, if you could change or accomplish one thing, what would it be, and how would you want to be remembered?
I'd like to be known as someone thoroughly dedicated to their alliance community. I would have liked to accomplish a decisive victory, even though I think we won the war overall, except for the stages where Alex actively undermined us with the beige thing and the reversal on GPWC.
Were there any other mischaracterizations of you which are totally incorrect, or that might surprise the general player base?
Well, one that seems to be popular is that I was planning on doing such a move to impose a hegemony upon the game the entire time, or that our entry was to establish a hegemony. It's also commonly said that I personally commissioned GPWC due to us being broke when that wasn't the case. Another is that I initiated all of the grudges. I'm also seen as extremely paranoid, even though I had plenty of reason to be cautious.
What is the full story of the Inquisition from your perspective?
Well, I was approached by BK, Brotherhood of the Clouds, Chola, and Cornerstone to make Inquisition, and it was surprising since while relations with BK had improved since the end of Silent, I didn't expect them to be willing to bounce from Obsidian Order and Syndisphere. We did have the DOP done by that point, but I didn't expect a full-fledged block. Anyway, the Sphere didn't have much time together before the Alexio convo with Bezers came into being, where Alexio said TS was gearing up and trying to get allies involved for a hit. He was allied to Syndicate at the time. We couldn't share the screenshots, so when we declared, we just got called liars. That continued throughout the war. We actually managed to get an edge for a while because they did a massive down declare that was botched, but they were able to recover. In retrospect, it was a mistake not to peace out, but people were more belligerent when there were some preliminary peace talks. Then it became a slog in the low mid tier, and we had alliances dropping out and had to admit defeat. A lot of people split off from Zodiac at the end, and BK had several people splinter, like Lord Strum, Zoot, and Yosodog. GOG joined Inquisition. There were treaties with Acadia and others. Syndisphere did a somewhat flake split after the war, but then KT, TGH, and Bros and other people were intent on trying to roll IQ out of existence by making BK feel like NPO was a liability. Some mergers like Lordaeron into Cornerstone, and then Cornerstone Zodiac into BK. Not what led to Islamic Crusade. Islamic Crusade was basically a low mid-tier slugfest again, and we were only making progress into upper mid-tier at the end, but we decided it wasn't worth it to continue and just accepted the white peace. There was stuff like the TKR TGHKT war that took the focus off IQ, and then Prefontaine suggested rolling TKR at a later date. He got Partisan involved, and the condition was that we'd have to cancel IQ BK after the war. I agreed to it since otherwise we had no real path to inflicting damage on TKR, GOB, Guardian, and so on at a later date. It was kind of a conflicting situation since TKR and TCW had tried to improve relations with IQ, and Felky was doing a really good job. But we didn't see there being another opportunity to do it, so essentially if we accepted their overtures, we would have been extremely reliant on them in the future. Nightfall happened, and then TKR, Guardian, GOB, TCW got ruled, and there were some coordination problems, so people got upset with BK. BK was perceived to be belligerent in that time period, and there was a suggested ruling of TGH, KT, Oblivion, and others by some people. But it didn't happen. The war ended, and then I was pressured to follow through on the deal with Partisan, even though Partisan was gone. There was also a massive coalition being planned to snuff IQ out. I extracted the concession and the embassy on Syndicate server from Helm's Kaiser Sons that if BK was getting curb stomped by multiple spheres, we'd be able to defend them. Syndicate thought it was negotiated away in private when it was cited as a reason for us to be allowed to enter into dial-up. We did the cutting when BK was approached by TCW, so they had somewhere to go. BK had also wanted to boost people to higher city counts and didn't want to strictly adhere to tiering anymore, so it was compromising IQ's viability anyway. I thought TCW and co would give them enough of a security blanket. BK apparently pissed off. That's not a criticism. A lot of people in the time period, including TS. So when they wanted to roll chaos and the Sphinx leak happened, they were utterly screwed. Most of their allies totally collapsed and people were piecing out. Meanwhile, TS did the whole only hitting GOB Guardian thing. Originally, Sisyphus said that if TGH did misfired spy attacks that we could hit them, but then he reneged and negotiated them away. I brought up the threat of Kershtag rolling NPO separately after the war. Sisyphus basically told me to screw off, and I continued to try to make the case for intervening. Meanwhile, Adrian had a convo with an NPO ally, and it was relayed to us that she was counting on TS to keep keeping NPO out, and so they could roll NPO at a later date separately. I tried to negotiate other routes with TS, but they blocked everything, and ultimately I stopped listening to them, and we hit TKR. The other side couldn't accept it, even though at most it would mean equal damage, even if we won. They basically vowed to kill us. TS pieced out and talked shit to other people and ghosted me for several days, even though they were informed 2 days ahead of the attack. The only people trying to make things work were Housestruck. Meanwhile, we were zeroed out, but gave BK and others an opening to rearm, and we were able to rebuild stuff. Then we did the whole slow working up to mid-tier and so on that took up most of July. Several of the alliances, like Carthago, didn't think surrender was viable and wanted to wipe peace. This was unacceptable. We finally got into a position to take the very upper tier out, and they went down hard. TS then did the Carthago WR thing, and that was the final straw, since they had been insulting me the entire time. So that front opened up, since the perception was that TS would align with Kershtag after the war and roll us at a later date. Over time, it became clear Kershtag was also trying to get Farkspear on board for future rolling, so the idea shifted to weakening them as much as possible while we had them zeroed, since a lot of things had to go right for us to actually zero all of these people. That's when the attrition talks started. Later on, George lost interest in BK, demanded peace suddenly, and he decided to go after me, Keshov, and Leo, and it seemed like he was being offered future protection by the other side. Sphinx started wanting to distance himself as the war progressed, despite having been on board with the hardline stances, and he started making his block and began trying to do peace with Coalition A separately. The North Point thing happened and they were allowed to beige Coalition A en masse. He preempted the TCW block since it was clear TCW was going away. TCW then hit us and colluded with Syndicate and others for beiges, and Alex refused to do anything about it, despite NP colluding in game PMs. He maybe did a nation strike on one nation, but the damage was done. Then Farksphere got involved in spite of the NAP, and it became a lot more of a pain in the ass. We were managing it well enough, but then Alex decided to confront NPO after implementing the Illuminant change, and he said heads were going to roll. The whole thing where he demanded an apology in return for not doing the bans happened, and we couldn't have accepted it since we would have validated his decision and admitted to cheating, which we didn't do. Then it was pretty much game over since people pieced out en masse, and while Seeker wanted to continue initially, there was no longer the morale necessary for it because of Alex's helping of Coalition A. Then all the disbandments happened. I just included everything that is considered IQ by the wider community, even if IQ was no longer in existence.
How much did you borrow from Seb and Syndicate, and where did the MPO bank end up? I was told you borrowed 40 billion from Seb and got another 20 billion from Syndicate and resources from Nova, but maybe that's wrong. Rumor has it the MPO bank ended up with Rose, which would be odd.
I think it was 30B in total. No money was borrowed from TS. There were bulk resources deals with Nova earlier in 2019, but we didn't know what Poobah was doing. The bank holder was banned and framed by Borg, so the bank was deleted then, as far as I know.
On the economic side of things, did you ever think IQ would overtake Syndicate/EMC, and did it need to in order to beat them? Essentially, was it possible for you to win, or were their banks and advantages too great? Nowadays the banks are unfathomably large, it feels impossible to succeed sometimes.
Overall, no, they had just accumulated like hundreds of billions, maybe even a trillion back then, which is why it was so surprising they balked at 45 billion in reparations. We could have tried to be more effective through the tiering and more ROI effective spending, but we wouldn't have been able to keep up as long as they could whale out and do the high infra belts. It would have taken maybe several winning wars to start even reducing the disparity. That was another motivation behind continuing the war.
What was your goal then? If you couldn't beat them, wouldn't it have been more effective to try and get more of them on your side? Fighting a permanent war for survival isn't fun. Or is all of Politics and War just a war for survival? I'm not versed on CN politics, so maybe trying to destroy your opponent and rebelling against that is the game. Sometimes people talk about CN like that's the case.
Just to make it easier for the next war or make them reluctant to fight us, knowing it'd be a protracted war. They wouldn't have wanted to allies. GOB was always clear they didn't see allying mid-tier as worth it. It's similar with Guardian and others as well. If we could have kept TCW for sure, then we'd have been more likely to peace, but it started to grow less likely. The other side was already courting them. It might have been a war for survival the entire time. While in CN, losing wars set alliances back for years, and many did disband early on or just go very inactive. Sometimes the sides would flip for 1 or 2 wars though.
So did you just try and take it one war at a time? Find the fun in achieving lots of smaller goals rather than seeking real victory? That's a radically different mindset from how they portray you. They say you wanted to win the game, and I've always doubted if that was even possible.
Well, we did want a decisive victory where they didn't escape unscathed. If we could have sat on them eternally, then that would be winning the game, but there were people wanting peace like goons, so we were bound to just go on with it eventually if the terms were accepted. They also say I wanted to kill the game, but that wasn't possible either. They were just playing up like they were dying to make us seem like the villains. Blogs helped them make the case, but even then the rationale stated clearly that it's mainly just to weaken them rather than finish them off entirely. There was some bluster, but that's what it was.
So is it generally better to win the immediate war, even if there's a high risk of being betrayed after? And were there any other agreements or understandings that you made with the Syndicate? Because the agreement to defend BK is wild, that's not well known.
I think it is probably better to win the immediate war first. Like I said at the beginning, when they declared on Guardian GOB, they had said that spy ops would be ground for expanding, and then they didn't. It's too bad I nuked the channel since our hit on TKR was leaked, and the only people I told about it were in that channel. So when they pieced out and ghosted us, I was scared they'd leak more stuff.
How did you nuke it, and how did you manage embassies back then? We try and do our diplomacy in our servers, but the big alliances are very resistant to that. They like to have it all in group chats they own, or direct messages.
Well, I nuked the channel by deleting it, I think. We had an embassy server, but a lot of diplomacy was done in group chats.
Is there a specific set of important moments, statements, or conversations which made you sure they were trying to wipe out MPO and the Inquisition? I always remember Sketchy's speech where he said everyone will go down with the ship, and I know vaguely of the Alpha War leaks, but I imagine there were probably several more compelling things at the leadership level.
It was the general reaction to the declaration thread from the opposing side's leadership and other OWF stuff. Lordship even said we had to cripple TKR or else. Kiga said I had tried to establish a hegemony before and that it would be my last attempt, even though I had never done that. All I had done in the past was try to counterbalance against Indosphere and DMC. There wasn't really anything in private because we didn't really talk to them until they started wanting to surrender. They were sure we'd run out of stuff. It was mostly the public posturing by Sketchy, Borhan, and others. They did shit talk me on the TS peace talks with Kershtag.
What about prior to that war? Sentiment was kinda stronger by Impult. I remember talking to George and Leo, and they said the other side wanted to wipe you out since like Trail, the global war of 2017, and especially after it.
I don't remember anything being said before Trail, besides the Bezos Alexio convo. They were organizing a coalition to kill IQ before it split. AC was to kill IQ as well, but it didn't work out as well as they wanted.
How did you know that though? Was the evidence overwhelming, or was there a catalyst for either, a leak or an argument or a coalition server?
Oh, it leaked.
If it's not still OPSEC, by who and what was said?
I'd prefer not to say who, but it was basically that the rest of the game was planning to hit IQ after Nightfall. With AC, there was a leak from a protectorate that was going to defect, and it was also openly stated as an aim by some people.
So I know about one of the plots around AC by happenstance, and it is ridiculous that it's forgotten, so I'd love to pick your brain about that. Polaris and the United Empire of Zaharon were planning to sign the Knights Templar and create another bloc. I spoke to Abbas several years later, and he said that they feared that Polaris was trying to pull KT away from them and into IQ, and that KT was almost on IQ's side during Trail, but backed out on a hit on TCW at the last minute. However, I'm not entirely certain Polaris was on your side. I remember them doing weird things and kinda extorting IQ. What really happened with all that, in your view?
I think they did try that. KT was originally going to go in against TCW, but then they thought it'd be a loss. Polaris did want to do things independently, but they were mostly aligned. I don't think they would have totally broken off.
This might be random, but why did you protect Castor and Lordaeron/Assassin Order? I remember back in 2018 he was trying to undermine IQ by creating a third sphere to contest the lower tier and essentially hand victory over to EMC. Sometime after that came to light, then BK and GOG blitzed them, and supposedly you were furious, and after getting your allies to stop, you paid reparations to him. Then Castor defected anyway by merging with TGH.
So with Lordaeron, they were actually with us and helped in Trail of Tears. Though the problem there was Castor took a hardline stance when EMC's down declare blitz failed and we had the upper hand, but then he wanted to pull out. 2018 is Assassin Order. I took that on since I thought they might be helpful, but he kept shitting on IQ, so it wasn't going to work. I also pissed off Right Honorable by keeping it since he hated Castor. I was saying it was realpolitik and that it was better to have them with us. They were going to drop us regardless of the hit. Their plan was to ally stratagem. I was more annoyed than furious because I just wasn't paying much attention due to being sick when the BK GOG did it, since it was getting cancelled anyway. They weren't reps. That's what he said. It was more rebuilding aid. They already hated us by the time they merged into TGH. So yeah, I thought Castor was swayable until he started going full anti-IQ. Also, with Lordaeron, they still stayed an ally even after Castor left, so I think it paid off and they were in Cornerstone BK after that. It had a nasty consequence in the end since Gorge from Lordaeron got a high gov spot and then sold us out so he could whale out.
What did you think of working alongside VE back when it was united as one alliance? I'm from a post-VE world, so it'd be interesting to know what type of great power it was.
VE had issues with cohesion and wasn't fully united. I think they had some activity issues until the GOTG rebranding. There were also people in there who wanted to move to Syndasphere.
If the final war hadn't happened and instead you had rolled KT, would you have been prepared to fight BK afterwards?
Yes, would have been prepared to hit BK. I offered to hit BK after if TS would let us intervene versus Kershtag. It wouldn't have been a grudge war though. It wasn't accepted.
You mentioned they were trying to annihilate IQ. Do you think the final war was inevitable in some sense?
If the Rainbow League didn't happen, then the final war wouldn't have happened. More like NSO and BKTCW would end up at war after the Chaos Catalog rulings. Maybe someone goes after BK and then PO individually after.
What are your opinions of Abbas and Partisan? Were they die-hard enemies or were they more pragmatic? You three are kind of considered the most influential players of all time.
I was willing to work with either, but I think Abbas really just didn't like me. We were alliance earlier on because we were working with Rose, but he still had some disdain for me over CN, and that made him act as an enemy sometimes. With Partisan, it was on and off. He did roll us to start with, but then he was friendly when there was no reason for him to be, and I did appreciate it. Maybe I won him over with my posting. He said he would have done something with us if Inquisition hadn't happened. He wanted to do Sphere after as well. Abbas and Partisan were really good at what they did. I think they're super influential even when they're not in Gov. They are able to shape things just through sheer soft power.
Did you employ spies to learn stuff about the other side? It's not discussed, but it's very prominent now. There's hundreds of them.
We didn't really use spies.
Did you ever think multipolarity or minispheres was going to work? Or did you think CN-style bipolarity and temporary hegemony would prevail?
I didn't think mini spheres would work. I think eventually bipolarity would resume. Maybe history has proven me wrong since I've been out of the game, but I've seen some people say it sucks now.
Which player or alliance do you think was your biggest rival or enemy in Politics and War? If Syndicate was willing to move on, why was the game so committed to wiping you out?
Well, Abbas was inactive when we teamed up with Rose. Kigaz and I got along. There was no particular group. It was spread across many alliances. Well, TS did try at first. They then retreated from their leadership role. Though it's funny because the alliance we hated at the start was Mensa, but we got sidetracked since BK hit us, and we had had good relations with them before, and we had to focus everything on BK instead.
I have a question about your FA style. Syndicate creates these campaigns against people, which destroy reputations, and they treat every small dispute like it's important. Rose is silent, and they take their punches to save up for a kick, i.e., a revenge war. That's my experience with them. Is it the same as yours? And what was your approach to dealing with smaller disputes, insults, and trying to convince allies to work with you? And were you very proactive in reaching out to people, or did you wait for them to come to you?
It's similar to my experiences. We mostly had to take smaller disputes and insults on the chin. We tried to organize allies, and I sometimes put in effort to try to get them to speed mechanically if they weren't. I was very proactive in the beginning when I was promoted, and to keep MPOs affiliatized, and also with building bridges with Rose UPN. But it ultimately didn't work out since Indosphere was able to move first before we consolidated. People shat on me for losing the wars that resulted, but the implication is that I should have just bandwagoned onto the Syndosphere side for an easy win, but we didn't want to do that. Then we were in the political wilderness after the Silent War happened, and we had no real chance to change people's minds until BK got sick of TKR. He was more reactive then, but we were still looking for smaller allies. The problem was a lot of people didn't want to touch MPO, so we couldn't make a lot of headway, and the MC versus IQ dynamic made it a very polarized game, so it was really a mix of both.
How did you deal with the possibility of allies and coalitions betraying you? It's sort of an ever-present worry for us because of stigmatization. I imagine it was quite a big deal for you in PNW, but also potentially in CN, which sounds more ruthless.
We tried to placate them as much as possible, but if they really wanted to defect, we couldn't really do anything about it since we were on the losing end for wars.
I see. My method so far has been to sign people from different camps, so it's less likely both will betray us at once, and to skip wars if I suspect our allies will roll us after them. Is that a bad strategy?
It could lead to conflicting obligations and put you in a bad spot. I don't know if you want to skip them. That might make it a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Would you consider Abbas your biggest rival in politics and war? If not, who would it be? And who do you respect the most outside of MPO?
Partisan, probably. He ended up being a rival more directly than Abbas, even though Abbas puppeteered things. I think it'd probably be Finway, Leo, Seeker, DNG, Ozravan, Jazz, and Emperor Marx, but if you mean outside that orbit, then Partisan again. I have to say this though, DNG was the greatest. He could have defected at any point in the game. He could have pulled an SRD, he could have pulled the Sphinx, he could have cut his ties to BK and GOG when UPN cut us. Yet he never did. He always opposed the traditional hegemony. He represented everything that was good in PNW. He was a paragon of virtue.
What distinguished Partisan or made him good at what he did in your experience? To be honest, my exchanges with him have been mostly arguments or debates or seeing as propaganda.
He was good at keeping a wide range of allies in line, and even when he was out of TS, he was making big FA moves.
How do you think he managed to do this, and how did you counter the proxies he used against you, such as Mensa and Jest? These are quite a common problem for new alliances now.
I think he was very charismatic, and also TS used money with some of them. Mensa never hit NPO directly outside of coalition wars. With Vanguard, it was a different story, but there wasn't much we could do except rely on Rose to do something. With Jest, it was very harmful to the alliances, especially since they rebuilt after and Islamic Crusade happened. There wasn't much that could be done to save the upper tier.
I thought MPO carried Trail and AC, though Mpolt was definitely on another level.
We did well in Trail, and we had a lot of TS and some TKR lockdown. AC, we started to have a big impact, but there was a limit to how far up we could push.
Was Abbas ever openly hostile or candid in DMs, or was it always roundabout? Same question goes for Partisan.
They were usually not hostile in DMs. There were arguments, but not hostility.
Do you think Partisan and Abbas and the other side was right to fear MPO and IQ? Were both sides acting analytically, based on somewhat justified grievances, or was it irrational? And were there any instances which made it easier for them to villainize you prior to Mpolt?
Just as much as any group. I think there was some resentment of EMC for always winning, and they just resented the tier consolidation. There were some incidents with BK where BK stood its ground, and that angered the other side. I don't think NPO did anything specific to get vilified, and they didn't pursue that end goal until we declared.
That's surprising. I think most of the game only saw the public-facing forum arguments and propaganda, and so are a lot more emotional about it. Are you surprised by how MPO is regarded now?
I'm not surprised by that, but I am surprised people still talk about it.
What strategies did you use to try and build bridges pre-Mpolt? You built a very diverse coalition with lots of former enemies. We were paperless for a long time, in part because people just wouldn't talk or reconcile with us.
Just basic FA. We didn't really have former enemies involved except BK and TS later on. I had always tried to be nice to other alliances.
What did you make of Acadia and UPN? I remember you allied UPN when MPO first formed, but later they signed Rose. From everything I've heard, they were kinda slippery to work with FA-wise, and were not super useful militarily. Lovely people though, from my brief interactions.
I thought Acadia was especially good. I really liked UPN, but then they cut us because they thought the CB was bullshit in Trail of Tears, since we couldn't share the screenshot, and also because they didn't want to be tied to Central Alliance, because we'd still be in the thick of things. We actually didn't sign UPN when MPO formed. It took me a lot of time to get them to sign when I'd been working on it for months, and it was too late because TS was ready to go aggro. I think they were usefully useful militarily on the offensive. They were actually allied to Rose before MPO, but Rose cut it when they split Paragon from Covenant. Then when UPN cut us, they eventually got Rose Protectorate deal.
How did you go about convincing them? Was it just DMs and trying to convince the FA head of the threat or need to balance? FA methods are kinda secret now. I remember Abbas saying he was messaging people to message other people and almost social engineering. I don't know how prevalent stuff like that was though.
Yeah, that was it. I think that happened sometimes.
How important was back-channel diplomacy compared to public diplomacy? Was the latter worth doing in your experience? A lot of alliances are forgoing it entirely now.
Back channel is more important, but doing both is ideal if there's adequate stuff. I heard a lot of alliances are having trouble with stuffing.
Are there any strategies you found effective when you were trying to persuade people through back channels or public diplomacy? I've found that people don't really care about balancing at all, and it's difficult to persuade bigger alliances to work with us. I've heard people say figure out what they want and help them with it, but well, the big alliances don't really need the help in 99% of cases, and it's expensive to do.
It was mostly either shaking things up or wanting to unite against a common threat. I think things have changed since then because smaller alliances were constantly recruited, like BK signed all those alliances, and we were taking on protectorates. TS used to shine a bunch too, and tried to constantly flip alliances. I signed USN when no one else wanted to, and they proved effective.
You've dealt with a fair bit of directed toxicity from your opponents. How did you handle it, and how did it clash with needing to build relationships with other people for FA purposes?
I just tended to take it on the chin, though I talked back until the last war when I was thrust into the villain role and tried to punish them for it. A lot of doors were closed, but we were able to find people who were willing to stick with us. It didn't really clash.
Weren't you worried they could use information gleaned in DMs against you? I find that I only really talk about the game, and that's kinda limiting in comparison to some FA people that are much more out of character and therefore have stronger relationships.
Yeah, it was a concern. OOC stuff can really help with FA, yes.
Any advice on how to find a balance?
I guess just try not to give away too much personal info and keep most of the interactions about game stuff.
Is being needed an ever-present concern that needs to be reinforced to maintain allies?
Yeah, it's easy for relations to deteriorate if they're not actively maintained.
Did you ever envision IQ, or any alliances in it, being permanent allies? Or are all allies temporary? Like that old quote, "We have no permanent allies or enemies, only our interests are eternal."
No, but it sort of turned out that way. I think most allies are temporary, though.
There are a lot of top 30 alliances which stylize themselves like MPO now. EVH and Singularity are 100% tax dictatorships with heavy tiering. If you were placed at their helm, how would you navigate a multipolar environment compared to a bipolar one? A lot of alliances are struggling to figure things out, so your approach would be interesting.
I try to maintain good relationships, or at least not openly antagonistic ones, with as many spheres as possible, and try to avoid toxicity in wars so they don't turn into long-term grudges. I don't have much experience with it since it was always bipolar when I was around.
When you were crafting narratives or trying to persuade members or other diplomats, were there any strategies or concepts you found helpful? Abbas once told me that he tried to use metaphors in all his posts. People often describe your posts as just pleading victimization, but I'm not sure that's entirely true or without utility.
He was mostly stressing common threats and getting people on board against them. I also stressed that defeats aren't too bad and we kept morale high enough. It's not pleading victimization if it's true. People carried grudges against me or MPO from the CN the entire time. I think it was useful, they just don't like being painted as being in the wrong.
What can you tell me about the tensions between the other alliances? Since you left, it feels like the game has been TS versus Rose, and their shadow empires, and I wondered what you thought of their relationship.
I recall GOB hating COS. There was BK TKR since TKR treated them as a subordinate while in Obsidian Order. It's hard to think of really deep enmity since most of them were rather friendly to each other. There was essentially an old boys club. I don't really know of the current tensions between TS and Rose. In the past, it was about TS teaching Paragon to sign alliances like Mensa and Guardian. There's been a lot of turnover in Rose, so it's hard to think of it as the same alliance from back then.
How far did our old boys club extend? Did it include alliances like Seven Kingdoms and UP and Acadia, or was it primarily the early TS, Rose, and TKR people?
Seven Kingdoms kind of lost relevance over time, so not really. I don't think Acadia and UPN really fit into it, since they were almost always on the opposing side as them. So mostly TS, Rose, TKR, TGH, Guardian, and KT under Kigaz.
Are there any esoteric and funny events that no one knows about and that aren't OPSEC anymore? I think almost every player has one good story that they never forget.
We were planning to preempt the anti-IQ coalition in May if IQ hadn't split. Also, Octor was a mod, and that's why Alex didn't ban him.
What did you think of Hogwarts? I've always heard very conflicting things about it.
I thought it was a decent alliance and they had good intentions. I appreciated Partisan resetting things with me. It was really bad they hit Zodiac though. Shouldn't have done that.
And was that at the same time you got the loans from Seb? Why did people like Abbas, who were close to him, permit the loans or not work to undermine them?
I think the Seb loans were later on. I don't think Abbas was active, and it was in Seb's best interest to do it because we were the best borrowers.
Did insults ever motivate war more than strategic considerations?
Maybe a lot of rivalries in the game have been more personal issues than necessarily strategic considerations, but they kind of are mixed, as people tend to wait until it fits into a strategy.
Hegemony is a complicated issue. I've spoken to Frawley almost a dozen times, and he's told me about MPO joining games and essentially conquering them. The logic being that someone will always win these games, so they should try. It's a remarkably similar position to some of the propaganda used against you. However, that obviously wasn't possible in Politics and War. Is the pursuit of hegemony and winning games a point of contention between you and the rest of MPO? And although it was impossible in Politics and War, do you think they might have tried if you had retired?
That happened in some games, but for instance, MPO hasn't conquered nation states. It's not really possible either, and trying to establish control over others usually causes significant blowback there. It was impossible in PNW since it was always a goal of people to prevent anyone from doing that, and also the admin actively intervened against it when it even came close to happening. I don't think that it was actually the case, though. I was hoping number one in a strong position would be enough as opposed to outright CN tier domination. It wasn't really that contentious, but some people did want outright domination. I can't say what they would have done without me. I did bring personal baggage, but I think I provided enough value to offset that.
Do you think any of your rivals in Politics and War aspired to be hegemons themselves, and perhaps levied the accusation against you hypocritically?
Yes, I do. TKR and TS would be the main ones. Rose also wanted to have a ton of influence without treaties.
Why do you think Rose preferred to take a secret treaty approach, and is there any reason TKR and TS failed to establish their own hegemonies despite having considerable power?
I think Rose just didn't want to be seen as having many treaties. At one point, they and TKR did have one for a while. I think TS did get tired of it at one point and then split off, but I believe they wanted to be dominant again.
I remember having a debate with another player about the idea of semi-hegemony, because war is such a central game mechanic that no true hegemony can be formed, because it would starve the game of action and therefore activity, and ultimately the game and all its alliances would wither and die. He proposed that the big alliances, TKR, TS, and Rose, needed to create enemies or section off part of the game to roll so that they could keep themselves alive and prosperous. Do Do you subscribe to that idea, and is hegemony therefore impossible, or is it wrong?
I don't really like that idea, to be honest. It seems like it'd be really boring. I think it's impossible since just enough of the player base won't allow it to happen.
Do you think anyone will achieve hegemony in PNW eventually, or is it unlikely that, for instance, TS will achieve the same level of power again? I go back and forth on it because I've seen a lot of peripheral alliances that are more than happy to sit on the winning side.
I don't know that much about current politics, but it could happen if one group of alliances stays more active than others and consolidates. IDK if TS will achieve that power again, given how isolated they are.
What's your opinion on secret treaties? Are they a valuable tool or damaging to the game?
They can be beneficial, but if there are too many, then they become a problem.
When KT and TGH both had former Rose leaders controlling them, Kigos and Sketchy, do you think they were still working for Rose, i.e. a puppet, or was it just friendship?
I think it was just friendship, but Kigaz went to KT after KT folded to rally people against MPO, so there was a big connection there.
Occasionally I've seen Rose send people to enemy alliances to build relationships. At one point Kigos tried to join TKR. Is that a common strategy among some alliances to build relationships, or not?
I don't really think it is, besides what Rose did.
There are some alliances like Gato and Legion that have migrated to Politics&War since MPO left. Were you surprised more of the big alliances from CN didn't come over, and were there any you reached out to during your search for invasions?
No, I wasn't, since they're mostly attached to CN because they've been there for a long time, so they didn't want to play another game. We mainly tried to get alliances in CN to join NPO, since they weren't interested in migrating en masse. I don't even know why Gato and Legion did it. It's because they're far behind and Legion only had a limited number of members migrate. Legion has 100 plus in CN. Also, some big alliances already tried, like VE and Non Grata via Alpha and Church of Adam. GPA did as well. UPN is another example. There were a lot of Sparta in TS. PNW also requires more activity than CN, and CN players are mostly casual. I had to put in a lot of work to make PNW as easy as possible for people.
If it were possible, which is questionable, why wouldn't you have defected to the other side? Was it for the sake of maintaining a balance in the game, or was it because eventually they would backstab you?
It was both. I had wanted to break the chokehold they had on the game, and they definitely would have backstabbed us. We had better relations with Perakov. We also got a lot of hostility from Syndisphere. Additionally, Syndicate were trying to court Rose and UPN themselves, so we were the most likely target anyway. This doesn't really suit the Syndisphere narrative for MPOFT because they started militarizing before the UPN treaty went up. BK was eager to roll us under Yoso's drum when TS hit Alpha, and even said as much. We also really hated Mensa, but BK got in our way. With TKR, there's the CN stuff, and they backed the war on Alpha even if it meant NPO got rolled hard, and that was when Jasmine was still regent, I believe. Alpha was probably NPO's closest ally at the time. Oh, TKR derided me in public and backed the war on us, so they started it, but I get blamed. People have generally said that I pursued the CN grudges when it was dumb. So there were no options in Syndisphere. Even if I had groveled to TS, they wouldn't have done it, to be quite honest. My goal was to make Peragov cohesive, but it took too long to get the UPN treaty.
How much thought do you think people actually put into balancing the game? Or was everyone just trying to win?
I think some people want to balance, but most want to win.
Where did BK's hatred of MPO originate? Is there a CN reason, or was it just opposite sides?
Just opposite sides. They had pretended to be friendly before that.
I remember there was serious tension between MPO and Mensa because of the Christmas War. Did it start there, or was that a consequence?
The Christmas War was one thing, but it carried over from Vanguard. We saw it as more likely we could get Mensa if we merged into NPO. Probably it was in Vanguard too when Mensa hit us the first time.
That makes sense, so Borhan inadvertently created NPO. How did TKR betray you? I read your embassy with them and TKR because it was made public by NPO, but it was kind of vague at points.
They supported the war on us by Syndicate and BK after excoriating me in public. They were very evasive in the lead up to. They could have gone neutral, but they had made the decision to screw me over. I didn't expect them to actually go neutral, just didn't like how they handled it since they made it personal. SK went neutral and gave us rebuilding aid. TKR instead just cancelled after.
Which war was that, and is there ever a true and clear-cut aggressor in bipolarity? Or is there an expectation both sides are plotting? That's still being debated today.
NPO's first time is the war. There was a clear-cut aggressor most of the time. Like in one war, Mensa hit Vanguard originally, and I believe got Guardian to drop us because they didn't want Rose's treaties to activate. The Guardian dropping might have been independently of that, so I don't really know. They wanted to get at Rose.
What would you have done in TKR's shoes? I've had similar disputes with allies, and I've contended neutrality is kinda required of allies in that position.
I'm not sure, maybe just hitting peripheral alliances instead of fighting on main fronts. I was in some similar positions in CN, but usually tried to stay away from the main front or the hits on an ally being direct.
Was the aid alone or just free funds? That's exceptionally rare nowadays.
The SK money was free.
How significant was the SK funds? Was it like 10% of the rebuild or much greater? I've told big alliances to do it for the past few years. For example, Rose could cover their allies' rebuild in large part with only 4 or 5 days revenue. It's nothing to them.
It was around 200 million, so maybe 5-10%.
Did you ever use game theory or real-life political theories to try and analyze problems in the game?
More indirectly than not, it could be considered as cooperative game theory. We also had the view would pursue their interests when it came to game changers. There was also the new player versus older player stuff. We had a first strike doctrine after NPOFT, which meant we would always go on the offensive if possible. Conflict theory factored in as well.
When NPO adopted the first strike doctrine, was that radically different from alliances at the time? And did it prove more effective than, say, TS hanging back to activate MDPs?
It stood out since TS only went on the offensive sometimes. I think it's more effective even if you're going to lose because you do more damage that way.
I didn't use conflict theory specifically, but I used something with similar assumptions, and I had a couple problems with it. One, I found players were not rational actors because of irrational grudges. 2, the game's resources weren't finite. Contests over treasures and colors could be analyzed with it, but not globals. Were FA heads and leaders, on the whole, rational actors in your view?
Well, I think growth is the finite thing, in my opinion, and losing alliances are set back majorly in wars if they lose multiple. There are irrational grudges, but they're mainly used when it's rational to pursue them.
Also, in the wake of the final war, I proposed a theory about reputation that I'd like your thoughts on. It's not particularly well regarded by the big alliances for self-apparent reasons. I think reputation in EMC or post-IQ PNW is a currency. Essentially, I think big alliances were bartering for good reputation in their coalition building. If you say nice things about us, we'll fight for you, but if you don't, we won't. But also, compliments could simply be bought for resources. For example, votes in the awards were sold, and this created a self-aggrandizing loop. I think the alliances that didn't participate in this reputation economy were the people that ended up in IQ, and later were targeted while other IQ alliances escaped retribution.
I think it is reasonable enough and likely applies to some degree. The thing with the alliances tied to IQ is sometimes they just didn't defect when they could have. Most of the ties to NPO were based on long-standing relationships, or NPO being their major option. The BK ties were different in that they signed a lot of alliances that they weren't that close with.
Assuming it's accurate, reputation theory, a big if, is it worth investing in soft power and trying to improve reputation artificially? Or are organic friendships the only thing that can be really relied upon?
It's worth it temporarily, but it doesn't usually prove reliable. I had tried to get soft power and people said they didn't hate me until we attacked TKR, but we were still the next obvious target if BK and TCW lost completely.
The rapprochement is interesting. Was that as simple as having reasonable conversations with people, or how did that transpire? Because that's post-Nightfall TKR, and Kedog was notoriously prickly outside Oblivion. Did they change their attitude without prompting because the tide was changing? And if so, do you think their membership level propaganda was overblown or divorced from the attitudes or the concerns of the leadership? For example, TKR's members were of the opinion that MPO was going to end the game. Did that ever come up in your talks with them, and was it an obstacle?
It was as simple as having reasonable conversations with people. I think they did. Adrian was trying, but there was no trust there because of the influence of people who are anti-me and TKR. I think they did change their attitude without prompting because the tide was changing. I think it was largely overblown. I think most people just saw a potential exodus of established players as ending the game when it went tough. It didn't really come up with them since we didn't talk much during the war. They mostly trashed me because we hit them.
Were alliances just prepared to ignore the sentiment of their alliance for realpolitik? I've had many arguments with syndicates because their members have been less than polite, but they argue strongly that it will never affect their politics, and I don't know if that's true.
Well, with TS, it did affect their politics in the past. They were super comfortable with insulting me and Kashov, so it's a widespread attitude in TS that they could bully people around.
Why did you split the negotiations with TS and TKR? It seemed kinda pointless.
I think they just weren't seen as part of Coalition A and they hadn't taken as much damage.
Once the moderation stuff was on the horizon, why not merge the chats, publish the peace terms, and force through a nap? The writing was on the wall in December, I think.
I think we just didn't want to give them the satisfaction of letting the beige stuff do it, and still the fear of retribution. I don't think they would have accepted staggered naps to avoid the possibility of them ganging up. Maybe we should have tried that though.
Yeah, I'm kinda shocked how little communication there was at every stage. Was the other side more proactive, and did they get rejected, or was it quiet across the board?
They were more proactive, probably got rejected, but I think they started to go slower with the side switching.
In my opinion, you won the start of the war mostly through chance, because the other side fumbled their advantages. Inversely, you lost the end of the war because you didn't take the win when you could have, and Alex intervening is chance. It was theirs to lose, and then yours to win, and somehow everyone lost. It's kinda poetic.
I don't think they really did. We had the numbers, though our side underperformed. The problem is wars aren't like championships, so if you don't get a decisive victory, you're screwed later on. The line had been crossed with the deck on TKR, and they weren't ever going to be cool with that. If we could have just taken the win, like say after GOB's infra was wrecked, without worrying about a future Kershtag TS Fart coalition, then we would have. You only had ugly options. Saw a sketchy said I burned everyone who had faith in me by doing the attrition thing, but I don't think they would have accepted a generous peace deal as a goodwill gesture. We also had no way of damaging them like they did of damaging us.
When was the war going to end? Did you ultimately decide to fight to the finish, or was it only a few months away, since Coalition A had already suffered massive attrition?
We were willing to end it in January or February if they agreed to the terms. We might have dragged out another few months if they didn't. Another thing I noticed is people saying the war was going to kill the game, all of the alliances on their side were playing dead. TS immediately got active when Kuryu and TCW gave them beige. Some people have been saying they were surprised we each quit after the bans, but it was the second of his moderation decisions that screwed us over. I was pleading with Alex to do something about NP TCW and he refused, so it was clear he wanted a coalition resurgence. We just saw more interventions coming from Alex, and he might have even nerfed planes during the war.
If they were just playing dead, why not end the war sooner?
Ending the war sooner meant their coalition would have been able to hit us at a later date. Some have said that we wouldn't have had retaliation if we just pieced them easily, but they were saying the opposite when we entered. We still wanted them to give up and go purple. I saw some people like Adrian say Gov was losing interest in the game, so it was trying to be effective. It wasn't great having to employ it since I don't like being the bad guy, but they were gearing up to curbstomp us with the rest of the game later on, so it wasn't much of a surprise when Immortals and Fark went in. Fark's if he had hated MPO.
Why didn't you publish the peace terms? I never understood that because they got leaked immediately. Everyone knew them, and it just led to this game where they pretended not to know to vilify your coalition, and your coalition pretended they didn't have them.
I think they were united enough to be a huge problem if we just let them off. I did not think they would fracture. As for the terms, hiding them wasn't my idea. I just went along with what people wanted since I wanted to reward people for sticking it out. That's not me throwing them under the bus, though.
What was your opinion on Goons and GBWC? I've heard people say that you were quite distant in the later stages of the war, and Keshav was doing more.
I liked Goons, and my personal ties to them from the past were the reason we got the treaty. I wasn't very hands-on with GPWC since we had delegated that. I did talk on the server sometimes, and it seemed to have a lot of cool people. I thought it was a good initiative by the people who came up with the idea and didn't think it was cheating at all. People have said I commissioned it because we were broke, but it happened virtually overnight and wasn't tied to war concerns. It probably would have happened without the war. I did do some traveling in December, but I was very active in late December, January. Keshav was more vocal.
Were you worried about the Goons at all? They were talking about defecting at some points, and they were doing some pretty controversial things in the community, such as mercy boarding.
It was a concern they were getting approached by other people. Yes, but for the most part they wanted to include us in their plans like they wanted to do a TKR Goons NPO block, but it wasn't going to work for multiple reasons. I was hoping the mercy boarding would be limited to mild stuff. Don't know where it would have gone.
What were the reasons for it not working? That's the first I've heard of that. I know TKR was trying to poach Goons, and Rhodes gave them a $6 billion loan, but I never knew MPO was involved in that too.
Well, it was Goons' idea and not TKR's, but the reason it wouldn't work is TKR and PO didn't get along.
There's always bluster in wars, particularly long ones. If it had been possible to sit on them indefinitely though, would you have done so? I'd assume not, but tensions were very high back then.
It was considered, but more likely to end within a few months.
What was your opinion of Citadel, Camelot, and some of the other smaller alliances during the final war? They were helpful militarily, but I imagine they also caused you guys some headaches. Oh, and why did you give Camelot the Most Immoral Alliance award? It's a cool skull emoji, but I've always wondered.
I think they were effective enough, and I appreciated them when they played ball with their strats, but they kept wanting to drop out, which was unfortunate. They also were not experienced, which I used as an argument for us being needed. Camelot itself stuck it out, so I appreciated that, but I don't recall giving them the Most Immoral Alliance award. It might have just been a joke if that did happen.
What was the extent of Polaris' involvement in Impult, and what did you think of them? They were in leadership channels when Camelot and Carthago were not, and I remember them being unusually strong proponents of perma-war and steeper operations. At the time, I remember thinking they were harsher than you guys and might have dragged things out longer.
Polaris was dragged in by their treaties and they were getting wrecked. I like them a lot though, but they had some issues adjusting to the plane strat since they hadn't done it much, and it can be hard to get people on board with it since it's very unintuitive, especially for CN players. They would usually get hit hard because they had some bigger nations and they would still be in range. I don't think they were that inclined to go with perma-war, but were ready to support it if it was desired, though they didn't want their bank. Phoenix did try to convince me to peace out in order to keep Sphinx, but Sphinx was going away at that point. I don't think they were harsher. As for them being in the channel, it probably came down to them having been aligned for a long time. I feel pretty bad about what happened since they had stuck with us even when they had the opportunity to ditch.
Their rhetoric is still quite intense about that war. Were they really passive?
They didn't really like the other side, so maybe they were vocal, but they weren't that insistent except for the bank.
Did you have any insight into the enemy coalition and what they were thinking and planning? I assume there were leaks throughout the war that didn't get filtered down to the rest of the coalition.
No, their stuff didn't leak, and they wouldn't have it. No one pulled a George on their side. Though I was told their server was really quiet in comparison to our sides.
People make a big deal of the peace terms in the final war, but Nightfalls were somewhat similar. Do you think the terms were harsher than terms EMC and Cindysphere had applied in the past, relatively speaking?
Yeah, they were probably harsher in comparison except for the reps in Oktoberfest, which required DEIC to take a loan. The problem is they had to be given the massive advantages held by the other side. If we had had the ability to just beat them outright in the first round and had done so repeatedly, they wouldn't have needed to be like that. It's just we couldn't do what they did to try to cripple us. They could do it quickly and easily, so they were harsher, but they weren't that bad because our side was only asking for a sum that was less than 10% of their wealth.
Do you think the war would have ended without the financial terms then? I.e., they would have just agreed to the rest?
No, they were willing to pay some. They wanted the amount cut in half, basically.
How much do you estimate that bank was in that war, total?
Probably 500 billion plus. TKR and Nightfall had bragged that the war would have minimal impact due to their massive bank. TS had a lot of time without fighting. Rose even had money to lend out. Then you get into GOB, Guardian, KT. And I actually went with the bond idea Jazz had, so if they didn't balk on the terms, then it wouldn't have lasted much longer.
How much was the bond? And what was the timeline? Maybe that's why.
The bond was 20 billion, and it was to be given upon the peace starting, and like I said, they balked, despite the total 45 billion being less than 10% of their side's total cash. Of course, the Polaris Bank added more, but still was easily affordable given their vast reserves. They also pulled out of peace discussions because they knew about the upcoming bans. We could have continued after the bans, but we were too upset at that point. Since one, he had already massively helped the other side by letting TS get mass BH by TCW, and North Point was allowed to BH a lot of the whales. The bans were not seen as legitimate, so we didn't want them to have credibility from our end by sticking around. We also thought he might even nerf planes during the war if we knocked a bunch of nations back down.
You told me the logic for including Syndicate in the war. They were going to be part of the Future Revenge coalition. But how was their reaction to being hit? And why do you think they gave up so fast and didn't join sooner?
I think they were really upset even though they had crossed the line by doing the OWR Carthago thing and insulting me the entire time. I think they just weren't expecting a hard war. I think they also thought it was better to stay out and make money, and it did help them. They also would have been out of range for the majority of the war.
If Partisan was around, would they have made the same decisions, or was he still in the background during that time?
I don't know what they would have done if Partisan was around. He's a different personality than Sisyphus, so maybe he would have been more willing to make a deal, but there's no way to know for sure. He wasn't in the picture. He was doing T-Jest on their side and later flipped before going back to TS.
If they wait, Does victory take the form of just winning the war, or is it more than that? I've heard Abbas say something similar, but sometimes the disputes are more intense than war would seemingly resolve.
It's usually just winning the war, but sometimes terms are imposed. Sometimes they are, but most people put up the front that they're willing to move on after one war, and that's what I was accused of not being willing to do. People thought I was persecuting TKR based on a grudge I supposedly wasn't letting go, even though my rationale for hitting them was that they wanted to hit us later on.
Why didn't you hit the Immortals and other neutrals like FARC?
We didn't think they would enter at first, and FARC was very anti-Ketog, so it wasn't anticipated they'd break them up. But then Kishi was made head of FA for FARC, and then it was easy enough to get what the fuck out. Oh shit. World Task Force out because Cosmo Kenny hated KT TGH, but FARC stayed because of her. She was even cooped temporarily when WTF and Horsemen pulled out so they could pull out too, and then they reversed it. There was also a leak from TCW of them planning to betray some alliances, so that also incentivized them to pull out, I think.
I didn't know Cosmo Kenny and WTF didn't like KT. What's the origin of that, and how was your relationship with them? If I recall correctly, they were also in Cybernations.
Cosmo hates Nazis and KT were perceived to be Nazis. He just didn't like Ketog in general. He tried to get us to peace with TS so we could focus on Ketog. With WTF, we didn't really have much contact in CN, so there was a rolling, but I don't think they carried that over. They were pissed off with us over the Horseman thing, though.
I've heard some people call KT a descendant of Nordreich because of one or two members from there. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
I think there might have been some Nordreich, but it was largely formed by non-CN people as far as I know.
What happened with Horsemen? I remember there was some strangeness with them during the final war.
Okay, so with Horsemen, we had a deal where they'd hit TGH because they didn't like them, and they agreed it would be a suicide round, and it gave us a cleaner entry than using the TKRCB because I knew we'd get trashed for not actually posting logs. They then got hit hard and the membership complained. I told them we'd go in on Friday, and Raul refused to accept, saying they'd be dead by then. So he went to TGH and Co. and asked for peace and then cancelled us. It was essentially a double cross by Raul, even though he could have just told me a suicide round was unacceptable. I had even said we would fund the rebuilds, but it wasn't good enough. And to be honest, they would have pieced out even if we had entered sooner, given the reaction they had, because we wouldn't have been able to hit the 26 to 28s that were hitting them due to infraboat. They just weren't willing to take real damage. If he had just refused in the first place, it could have been avoidable. This was actually in the logs that got dumped by Gorge, so I feel comfortable sharing it. Of course, they still would have gotten hit if that hadn't happened, since Kershtag hit all of our allies that weren't in the war, so he probably would have pieced out when that happened and maybe cancelled anyway. It just comes down to being unacceptable for them to get zeroed.
Is that war still OPSEC even though you guys quit?
Not really, but I don't have access to the logs at this point. That was a more sneaky move when we were trying to plead with TS to let us enter. And if I hadn't been convinced to plead with them more, so we would have entered sooner.
How did TS react to the Horseman plan? How were they relying on contacts?
They didn't know the true nature of it, and we said we shouldn't enter because Horsemen rushed in. They just weren't going to be swayed at that point or ever. They had shut down earlier pleas based on the threat of Kershtag, so their plan essentially seemed to rely on their contacts in alliances like COS and TKR, or it was to cancel us once our purpose had been served, as in letting TCW and BK die.
To what extent did their hit on Grumpy alienate them from that coalition? And why didn't they enter the war against you immediately? I might have asked that question before. If so, sorry.
They pretty much said that it could be solved diplomatically and stuff like that. If they just maintained their contacts, then we wouldn't get rolled. I think it just pissed off Ketog, but Chaos was still appearing friendly to them. As for why they didn't enter, they preferred to build up and save up, as far as I know. Think they also hadn't fully decided to cancel us at that point, but they might have anyway. Maybe there was opposition by HS, since HS was more moderate than they were on the entering the war thing. HS actually tried to get people to meet in the middle. There also would have been opposition from Church of Adam. Church of Adam was anti-Kerstag. They only turned on us because we dragged in TS later on.
Did you do any direct diplomacy with TKR or Kerchtog in the lead up to the war, or during its early stages?
There were some talks with TKR, but we didn't trust them, and I had a good rapport with Oblivion.
Was there any resistance to prolonging the war at the leadership level in your coalition? I remember Sphinx talking about objecting, but he also supported only negotiating on the first of the month. Polaris didn't object either, and I doubt Acadia and UPN did.
There was no real opposition until Gorge decided he was leaving BK, and then Sphinx had an about face because his membership in Gov pressured him. There's also just the issue in general with Sphinx that he had no right to moralize because he caused the war to happen in the first place with his lack of OPSEC. He put us in a position where we'd really have to cripple them, or else we'd get a lot of backlash.
Did Church of Adam approve of the war prior to the Syndicate's inclusion? And did House Stark ever consider joining you?
Yes, James was supportive of our entry and was upset when TS pieced out. He agreed we'd be next if they won. We had good relations, and we were even loaning them money after Church of Adam pieced out. With HS, they at one point said they would defend us, but then they decided not to help us. I didn't hold it against them. Then they went on to say after we hit TKR that they would have supported us if we had hit KT instead. I don't know how Church of Adam died during the war. They seemed fine, and they were even importing CN players who were fighting NPO there. And frankly, TS would have been fine if they hadn't done the OWR Carthago thing. If they had just told them to stick it out longer, then TS wouldn't have gotten dragged in at all. They were getting shielded on the Terminal Jest thing until that. I don't think staying out was that bad of a move for them. They just messed it up by tipping their hand with the OWR Carthago signings and exits. That was their actual blunder. They could have been making a fortune for months on end otherwise.
I heard a rumor about a CN war happening at the same time. Do you think the two affected each other besides Church of Adam's recruitment?
Not really. It was mostly people from the CN Alliance non-grata that went rogue but got countered by NPO when they hit an NPO ally, so they were upset because they had been allied to NPO before they disbanded to go rogue. Those went to Church of Adam.
Do you think OWR and Carthago would have re-entered the war at a later date if you hadn't preempted them? Nowadays they act like they were always planning to do so, but I'm not sure that's true.
I don't think they would have. They claimed they were entirely broke and probably preferred to just make money.
How powerful was IQ's tiering at its peak during that war? Let's say EMC reformed after the war, Kedog, TKR, and TS. Would your tiering have been enough to survive against them or even win?
It was very concentrated and such, but it would have struggled significantly against all of those. That's also a reason we wanted to enter, since I knew the alliances tied to BK would fall apart if we didn't, and would split off, but then they did anyway. Goons would go a long way, and we could fund some of their influx if they kept importing it from something awful. You probably would have had to import more players for the lower tier as well to have a chance. It would have probably have reduced us to only being contested mid-tier, most likely.
How did BK antagonize the other spheres in between Nightfall and the final war? You mentioned earlier that even TS was annoyed with them.
I think there were disputes BK and others during Nightfall, and then there were raid incidents and such. They handled things differently than I would have, but I'm not shitting on them. I just don't like taking hardline stances, and usually will try to accommodate people. I don't really like confrontation if it can be avoided.
Did Partisan ever try to convince you they wouldn't seek a revenge war after the final war? That's something they said when it ended, but didn't honor.
No, he didn't.
Did most of the diplomatic discussions happen in voice chat or text during IQ, and later during that war? Having dealt with the other coalition afterwards, it seems like they did everything through voice chat, so none of it was logged.
They happened in text, we didn't VC much. In retrospect, that would have been a good idea, but no one was anticipating George to defect.
One element that's been completely forgotten now is the extent of Vane's and the Whale's involvement. A lot of them ended up in very high-ranking positions post-war because they were militarily valuable. How much did you pay Vane's and the other people taking down the Whales?
I don't remember, several billion and some resources, but we didn't really mind doing the resources since we had a huge stockpile. And I didn't care at the end, so there was a failed hit on Church of Adam.
What did you make of TFP joining on your side and ultimately defecting? I remember that being one of the early cracks in the wall, and it frustrating a lot of people.
It sucks since they did it with Frontier as a result of us joining, so it was an anti-NPO move, and then they slaughtered a nation we were attacking and refused to do airstrikes. So then I caught flack for saying I'd report them. I was just really pissed off since it seemed like a deliberate move to fuck us over.
I remember Frontier Records declared a grand total of 2 offensive wars in the first 4 weeks of the global. Did you track their performance and chase anyone at that time?
I didn't really see them as meat shields. I saw us trying to save them from collapse. A lot of the BK protectorates just weren't useful. It was also difficult to get alliances to play along with the strategy, so I tried to assign stuff at the lower levels so we could be freed up for bigger nations, but there were mixed results. It was just unbelievable that they experienced so much attrition despite being on the winning side. I was annoyed by the defeatism from Carthago. With Frontier, though, Alexio later admitted that he wasn't having them do much to screw BK. And then he said I was nuts for rolling his alliance over hostility when he had been consistently hostile. Bad Company, when it existed, had denied us an embassy.
How active were your embassies? We don't put much effort into keeping ours constantly active. I know some alliances do, though. Were there any other alliances which denied creating embassies? I think we've been denied somewhere in the range of 40 embassies, but the list is growing shorter now. TI reopened theirs after 3 years.
They were decently active when we set up a server for them. There weren't any other alliances that denied embassies, so it was a big slap in the face.
What approach did you take to embassies? Did you have one with almost every alliance, or just a handful? I remember we had one with you guys, and we were trading raws for Manu. I imagine that was part of a broader effort to acquire resources.
We tried to keep them active. We had one with a lot of alliances, but not many with the opposing side.
I remember in the late stage of the war, the MPO's stat site had a secondary feature. It allowed guinea pig and MPO members to visit the site and see their progress. For example, if they changed their color, it would check the API before giving them the next task. What was the full functionality of that?
I don't remember it well, but it did that and also calculated alliance income, highlighted potential targets, and checked if people needed to buy stuff. It also showed war performance, so people were chasing stats.
I was talking to him about technology, and he said this at the end of a sentence, so I'm going to place it here.
Yeah, Lord of Darkness and Frawley worked really hard on the site, but we weren't going to do the fake apology in front of our enemies to not get banned and only get reset to like one city.
Was the apology required?
Yes, he said he would lessen the punishment if I apologized.
What was the full punishment, or would he have not banned you if you did?
The full punishment is what he did since I didn't apologize. He wouldn't have banned us if I did. He took money and resources.
Do you think MPO will ever return to the game, even if you do not? I've heard some CN and NS people talk about it. George is still very much of the opinion they will.
No, NPO is very anti-PNW and the people who can okay a branch are against it. It would make no sense since it would be far behind. I'd consider it very unlikely as a result.
How did you find working with Sphinx and TCW, And did you think his defection was reasonable and predictable or not?
He was good to work with until he had a change of opinion and began pressuring for peace. I think if the membership in Gov at TCW hadn't pressured him, he might have stayed longer. It was a bit predictable since the other side was focusing on PO and BK in terms of hate, so he saw an opening.
To what extent do you think the FA heads and EMC alliances had individual agency? Were they all oligarchies peer-pressured and constrained, or did they have the power to pursue a different path and chose not to?
It seemed their agency was limited since none wanted individual peace. I think some were oligarchies for sure, but others were not. They seemed very pressured. I heard Rose was pressured to join the war in the first place. I think some may have had the power to pursue another path, but chose not to do that.
What do you think your biggest accomplishment was in the game, and what's a moment or event you regret or wish you had done differently?
I think the last war was my biggest accomplishment since it felt like it left a mark, and PO played a pivotal role in turning the war around. We never had that ability before. I'd say I'd regret being so vocal in the coalition server because it was easy to weaponize. I just didn't think Gorge would leak since he had been allied for 2+ years. I regret not getting involved in PNW politics sooner as well. I was just a general member in Vanguard when I should have been contesting the battleground states, so to speak. I let enemies accrue influence without contesting them.
You mentioned how BK was very belligerent. Admittedly, we were too, and so was GOG. Do you think that held you back, or was it ultimately insignificant?
It hurt a bit, but it also helped in making us look nice since we were more diplomatic. That went out the window with the TKR deck since all the goodwill built up was thrown out the window, and everyone outside of BK and allies went back to hating me. But I didn't feel I had a choice since BK and TCW collapsing was a huge liability.
Why was BK and TCW collapsing a huge liability? I can understand not trusting TS fully, but we had already lost the war before you came in. If we just surrendered, it would have been difficult for them to roll you after, without IQ immediately reforming. BK wasn't likely to reconcile or defect, even if they lost.
Well, BK would have been out of commission. There was actually an idea floated to see if the other side would be willing to wipe peace. I did see it as a possibility would want to turn their attention to NSO, and the other side would try to reconcile with them.
I see. In the event they did reconcile, wouldn't you end up being on the same side as TS in the ensuing war? If they just abandoned you immediately, would BK really stay on the side of the new hegemony?
I don't think even just TS would be enough to take on the rest of the game, and there was a possibility of them ditching, since the purpose of having us not help BK would have been served. I don't know what BK would have done if that had happened.
How much longer do you think Kirchtog wanted the war to go?
I think probably at least a month. To be honest, the major concern was if that we didn't enter, the peripherals would ditch on their own and secede from BK TCW sphere, lose it lost, and then it'd be gone as a buffer.
Frawley and Anna have talked to me at length about how GPWC wasn't that financially important. Would it have made a big difference post-war though? I remember its members' activity was kinda questionable, so tearing them might have been difficult.
I think a lot of them would have just flushed out, but the actives could have continued being built up and would have been moved to the NPO. A few of them stuck around NPO after the Exodus.
To what extent do you think Cybernation's politics transferred over to Politics&War? I remember some people saying that the Knights Radiant was a continuation of Mushroom Kingdom, and the Syndicate was a continuation of MI6, and that essentially PNW was just a continuation of an older war. There's also a lot of hostility towards you and Umbrella, which is passively mentioned, which I don't understand at all, since the Cybernation's wiki makes it sound like you were a rival of MPO. What are your thoughts?
TKR's founders were MK, and it did play a role in how they did things. A lot of TS were MI6 earlier on, yes, but most seem to be gone with some exceptions like Wana and Partisan, but Partisan didn't really hold on to grudges after a while. Some of them do still. It's also the source of Abbas's hatred towards me since he was on my 6 and some other players not in TS. The hatred towards Umbrella is mostly from people who didn't fare well in CN. I was a historical rival of NPO as leader of Umbrella, but that ended in 2014 when we signed an MDOAP. A lot of PNW alliances have CN players who struggled, so there is a lot of dislike. I've also seen some people say I hijacked MPO somehow, even though MPO Gov was in our Gov channels. It has been said that PNW and PO was Umbrella, when that is not the case. The only Umbrella people in government were Octor 9. Octor was in government before I was. And there's very few resemblances. I've never seen somebody say a GOB was VE, even though SRD and Goldie were V the entire time in CN. Here are the commonalities. Both Umbrella and PNW and PO were run by me, and I micromanage some stuff. PNW and PO was a bit more rowdy than others, but it was nothing like Umbrella in that regard. Umbrella was an elite style alliance, and PO was a mass style alliance. Umbrella had voting, and PO did not have voting. I've also seen people say that Vanguard hijacked MPO, and that is not the case. The only Vanguard in government were me, Frawley, and Edward, and people wouldn't think of them as Vanguard, even though they were.
What's your opinion on the elite versus average player dynamic? You mentioned Umbrella earlier and said it was an elite alliance. I always thought of MPO as an anti-elitism alliance. Is that a change you purposefully made, or did you want to be more elite? And why didn't Umbrella come over to PNW? I don't know much about that alliance, but I am very curious.
I think the game is slanted towards elite players, especially in terms of being far ahead. It pretty much punishes casual players in war, although now it seems like just nuking is more viable than it was before. Umbrella was an elite alliance, but as time went on, people moved on with their lives, so we're less active. And PO as a mass member alliance was more casual since it mass recruited, and that meant you'd get a widespread amount of activity, and CN was way more casual friendly. Do you mean if I wanted MPO to be elite? No, because mass membership is a strength on its own and more viable long term. It didn't come over because there was also no interest in starting another game for most of the people, as they barely cared about CN at the point, but were sticking to it due to their nation's age. The people from Umbrella who were willing to play first went to Cynic's Alliance, Guerrilla Republic, which merged with the Earth Systems Alliance to form Vanguard. Then Vanguard tried to be elite, but we kept getting rolled and leadership activity was down, so the decision was made to merge into NPO.
What was your policy on protectorates? I only remember interacting with a couple of them, including Castor. BK took the approach of signing everyone because numbers are numbers. However, I didn't see that from MPO. Do you think big alliances give back by protecting others? Do you think protectorates should or should not fight in globals? And do you think signing protectorates increases the chances of members leaving to found their own alliances rather than staying?
A few of them were prior contacts, but with other alliances, I was willing to do it if I saw potential, though sometimes it was a mistake, like there was Sean Anthony who made several alliances. It's giving back, but also hoping the alliance will be an equal partner later on. I think it depends on the situation, like if it's one where they don't make a difference, no. I don't think it increases the chances of members leaving.
How did you combat inactivity? I think MPO was somewhat resilient to it, and you posted more FA updates to members than most alliances. However, you were on 100% tax, and the NAPs were very long.
Well, I tried building personal connections with as many members as possible, and we tried to keep the Discord as active as possible so people would see this community as worth sticking around for. I also made a point made it a point to simplify everything as much as possible, so even the most casual player would see it as no big deal to log in and do some clicks.
How much time did you spend on technology, websites, and so forth? I remember MPO being way ahead of other people, and I don't know if that perception is accurate.
Most of the technology was Folly and Lord of Darkness. They're way better than I am at doing complex things.
What's your opinion on optional treaties and paperless alliances? Do you think it was good for the game and useful for the alliance?
I think optional treaties and paperless treaties add something to the game, so I don't mind them.
Could you tell me about Umbrella? Their wiki is blank and it's hard to glean information about early PNW outside of the MPO Monogatari, which I imagine you'd at least partially disagree with.
Well, there was an alliance in 2007 called Genme that was from a website called General Mayhem. It was a mass alliance. It participated in bloc politics, but eventually got into a losing war called the Unjust War, and it disbanded along with most of the people in its bloc called the Unjust Path. A decent chunk of remaining members went to other alliances in the interim, but had plans to start an elite-style alliance. They eventually found someone to protect them and launched in December 2007. It would go on to join a bloc with other elite alliances called the Citadel. 3 of the alliances in Citadel were tied into a mega bloc called the Continuum. Over time, they began to split apart from it, and the majority participated in the Karma War in 2009 against the Continuum. After the Karma War, there was an exodus after an influx of members in late 2008. There was also another group that left, and the alliance was down significantly in terms of member count. However, there was a focus on maximizing tech importation with the remaining members, so an edge happened to be gained, especially since there was a big war in early 2010, and where the alliance had allies on both sides, but was relatively unscathed. Eventually, 2 blocks and spheres formed called Doomhouse and Pandora's Box. They waged a war together in early 2011 against both NPO and New Polar Order, but they began to drift apart from each other over time. There was later in the year a war where Umbrella had allies on both sides, but sided with Doomhouse. In 2012, there was another war that was a curbstomp on the group that had lost the previous war. However, at that point, NPO, Iron, and others were able to form a coalition against Doomhouse, so there was a highly damaging war that left Umbrella in a much more weakened position. It decided to subsequently leave Doomhouse and signed with new allies. Then a war against NPO allies was waged later on in 2013, and it was to be the last conflict against NPO. Umbrella signed new allies from a bloc called Aztec, and the initial plan was try to pursue another war against NPO, but there were mistakes made by certain alliances that altered the trajectory. NPO also began an initiative to try to mend relations with historical rivals, so he didn't want to roll them anymore. This would culminate in an MDOAP being signed with Umbrella, and the alliances becoming very close. There was a war with 2 big sides in 2014, and Umbrella had allies on both, but was on the winning side. In 2015, Oculus formed, which was a mega bloc. It pursued wars against smaller spheres for several years. In 2017, Umbrella began to plan its exit and went after a big donor nation with extremely high tech, so it was a protracted effort to bring it down to earth. In 2018, Umbrella disbanded, and some of the members started attacking alliances.
Did you have any strategies to combat poaching in PNW, or was that not a problem? I remember some players trying really hard to do it several times pre-Final War and during.
With poaching, most of the members were loyal to NPO first and foremost, or loyal to me specifically in terms of the former Umbrella members and personal contacts I brought in. I think Kev did try to and got one, but that person wasn't particularly attached to NPO.
What's your opinion on dictatorship and democracy in these games? The former was more prevalent in cybernations, and some people say it was better for the game and alliances in general.
A dictatorship is much better. Democracy is often a popularity contest. It was annoying to deal with voting and procedural things. It's also about skin in the game, as leadership is inherently more invested than others.
Do you think these types of permanent grudges are common in the game and are holding it back or adding to it?
I don't know of any permanent grudges currently in the game. I think it holds it back and poisons the well.
What is your opinion on norms and unwritten rules, i.e., you shouldn't roll protectorates? Were they helpful, selectively applied, or just words?
Not ruling protectorates has never been consistently applied. We'd get ours ruled in some wars, and they even tried to get one to council as a precondition for peace.
How was your Discord set up? I've taken an extremely minimalist approach, and I know some alliances, which also have forums, do the same. But then again, there are others with hundreds of channels.
Probably around like 7 channels.
What do you think of the 4 traditional departments, and are there any others you think are important, i.e. EA, MA, and FA? I know MPO has occasionally added other departments, combined them, or created ranks beyond High Gov and Low Gov. I think CN in general did things differently too. And what system did Umbrella have?
I think they do well in spreading the duties around. They can be really effective, though with FA there's only so much a low-level diplomat can do, and it can feel useless to them. Military affairs requires constant activity in wartime, so it can be a problem to especially have adequate staffing where it falls apart. With econ, it can be good for implementing a plan, but it can also be difficult to get people to do stuff. A problem, though, is there often aren't enough people to fully staff them and have them function smoothly. It helps to concretely define them. There's also the IAA in some alliances, which handle stuff like admissions. I think some alliances combine econ with MA, like TS had Jessica Rabbit doing both. That happens in CN too. Umbrella had FA, MA, and econ.
Are there any adjustments you would make to the 4 traditional departments? Right now, there's lots of guides just pushing the tradition on new alliances and not doing much innovating.
Yes, there were significant disagreements then. Procedures can be problematic and limit things at times, but yeah, it's easy to have them become obsolete. 100 was tough on membership activity, but even when I was in a lower tax alliance, there were issues. I'd combine them when possible or have special overseers who can check if things are running smoothly. I don't know how much innovation could be done.
When you were interviewing potential members or promoting people to Gov, what did you look for and what did you avoid?
I mainly looked for availability, willingness to put the alliance first, and consistency. Avoided people who thought they could overhaul everything. One time it was relayed to me that Vlad from KT was saying NPO only promotes in terms of seniority, but some people do a lot of work in a short time and then disappear, so if we can't rely on them, it makes no sense to promote them, and without proof they'll stick around.
What was the logic behind dual refining? I tried to do it post-war and it was not great. Since then, I think a lot of alliances just produce RAWs now to lower cash expenses and build cities faster. I remember you guys couldn't sell resources in bulk because of how much you produced, and that's still quite true.
I thought City 20 would be very effective. I wanted enough gas and munitions to last a war and beyond. I did see it coming that we'd potentially have to supply less prepared alliances. Abbas actually came to me and told us our refining was game-breaking once.
Do you think the other side was involved in significant cheating prior to the final war? I.e., do you think Kirchtog knew about Nova or took advantage of any other big bugs to secure their advantages?
I recall TS paying ARG for Beaches and Trail of Tears. I don't know about TKR and Nova.
Do you think ARG was an independent alliance, or a puppet/tool?
Aside from Silent War, where they negotiated a limited conflict when they could have made a difference in Papers, Please, they had consistently sided with Sindosphere and EMC.
Were there any other instances of unfair moderation by Alex pre-Npolt? I've heard BK people say that Treasure Island broke the game with Alex's sanction, and that's what truly propelled TS ahead.
I remember there was a glitch back in the day where V got a ton of cash, but I think Alex took it away and banned the person behind it. I also think TS paid ARG for Bages in a previous war, and he didn't stop the wars. Treasure Islands helped them a lot, and he shouldn't have allowed it.
Are there any game mechanics or changes which you wish had been introduced?
Well, more catch-up mechanics would have been useful. I also think it was bad he was planning to change the war system to nerf planes, and he did do that as anticipated. That was one of the reasons we decided to quit, since it was obvious he was out to lessen our impact, so that's one I didn't want. I also wanted some mechanical things that would make it less advantageous to buy as many cities as possible so the different configurations could come about. What would have been cool if there was a way to fight like a bot alliance so people could team up and work together when they normally wouldn't, since it would help with the acrimony.
If you could give one piece of advice to new players considering doing FA, what would it be? I make tutorials and videos, so I always try to find out what lessons are most important.
I would say try to find someone they want to work with long term rather than the most convenient trading partner at the time.
Final question. What have you enjoyed the most about the Nation Sims, and have you gained anything from playing them?
I enjoyed having my hard work pay off in the communities I participated in throughout my time. Learned how people function in hostile environments, and that it's easy to get overly invested in things that aren't that significant. I can't say I gained a lot, frankly, except getting to know a lot of great people.
Cue the applause while the curtain falls, because with that, the interview ended. Before I end the video, I'd like to make some observations and talk about my experience creating it. The first thing I want to say is that Roquentin was awesome. He answered every question I had, he put in a lot of time to make the video sound interesting for all of you, and he was patient with me when the video got delayed. I am very grateful, and even if you disagree with him on lots of issues, just like me, you can probably still appreciate this too. I know some people are going to say you didn't ask the right questions, and you're probably right. I asked every question I could think of, but I was limited by my game knowledge. I reached out to older FA heads to get more questions, but they didn't give me any. With that said, I think I asked a lot more questions than anyone else would have, and on a lot of topics. Oh, and I originally wanted to release this video before anyone knew Roquentin was active again. The reaction would have been amazing. Unfortunately, I took too long, but hopefully it still surprised some people, as much as it can surprise them when everyone knows the ending. He quit the game alongside MPO, and this video is just a nice bow on his story and a contribution to the game's history. Although in the course of this conversation, I developed a sneaking suspicion that he never quit. Maybe he was reading what people were saying about him while climbing their ranks. Now I'm waiting for the day when I wake up and see a top alliance change its flag and say,
oh yes, get snack upon. Neck bite.